Ghost Story, disturbing true spring break horror stories. A group of college students heads to a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for spring break. The place is deep in West Virginia, surrounded by dense woods with no cell phone reception. They plan for a week of hiking, drinking, and late-night stories around the fire. On the first night, strange things happen. One of them, Lucas, wakes up to find the front door wide open. He swears he locked it. No one else remembers opening it. Another, Riley, hears faint whispers outside, but when she looks through the window, there's nothing but trees and darkness. They brush it off as paranoia, maybe just the isolation getting to them. But as the nights go on, the incidents get worse. One of them vanishes for hours, only to return in a daze, unable to explain where they've been. Their food starts rotting too fast, and a foul smell lingers in the cabin, no matter how much they clean. Then comes the knocking. At exactly 3 a.m., soft taps echo through the walls, starting slow, then speeding up until it sounds like dozens of hands pounding from the outside. They check the door. No one is there. One night, Luke records the sounds on his phone. When they play it back, there's a voice. A single word, whispered over and over, leave, and then they see it. A shadow, too tall, too thin, standing among the trees, watching. The trip was supposed to be fun, but now, they just want to survive the week. Lucas stared at his phone screen. The audio file played back the same distorted whisper. The voice was deep, stretched like it came from underwater. Leave. It repeated 3 times before cutting off. He glanced at the others. Riley sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. Mark stood near the window, watching the trees. Nobody spoke. They had locked the cabin doors, checked every window. There was no one outside, no footprints in the dirt. No wind, no movement in the branches. The knocking had stopped after they checked, but something had been there. Daniel finally broke the silence. We should go back tomorrow. Nobody argued. That night, they slept in shifts. Lucas and Riley took the first watch. They sat on the couch, eyes flicking between the fireplace and the door. The air smelled damp, heavy with something sour. Around 2 a.m, Mark stirred in his sleep, mumbling. He twisted onto his side, his breathing sharp. Lucas leaned closer. The words made no sense, frantic, broken sounds. Then, all at once, Mark sat up, his eyes wide. He looked straight ahead, through Lucas, through the walls. They're already inside. Lucas grabbed his shoulder. Mark blinked, his body shuddering as he sucked in air like he had been drowning. He looked around, confused. His hands were shaking. I think I was dreaming, but the way he said it didn't sound sure. The next morning, they packed. The mood was tense. The car was parked half a mile down the dirt road. The plan was simple. Load their things, drive out, find the nearest town, and never come back. It should have been easy. Lucas opened the front door first. The air outside was thick with mist, making the trees look like silhouettes against the white haze. He took one step out and stopped. There were footprints, not theirs. They were spaced unevenly, like someone had been dragging 1 foot behind them. They started from the edge of the woods and led straight to the door, and then they stopped. No prints leading away, no sign of someone turning back, just a trail that ended at the threshold. A single blackened handprint was smeared on the wood. Lucas stepped back inside. We need to leave, now. They grabbed their bags and ran. The dirt road stretched out ahead of them, curving through the trees. The mist curled around their legs, swallowing sound. Every breath felt thick, heavy. Lucas glanced over his shoulder. The cabin was barely visible. The front door stood open, dark, empty. Then Riley stopped walking. Where's Mark? Lucas turned. Mark had been right behind them. A second ago, he was there. Now he wasn't. Daniel cursed. They called his name. Their voices disappeared into the trees. No response. Lucas ran back toward the cabin. His heart pounded. The door still stood open. The handprint still there. The living room was empty. Upstairs, he took the steps 2 at a time. The hallway stretched before him. Mark's bedroom door was open. Inside, Mark stood facing the window, completely still. Lucas stepped closer. Mark? No answer. He reached out. His hand barely touched Mark's shoulder before Mark turned. His eyes were wrong. Not just unfocused. Wrong. Too much white. The irises shrunken like his pupils had vanished. His skin looked pale, lips dry. Lucas took a step back. Mark's mouth opened. A deep voice, layered, not his own, spoke. You should have left. Then every door in the house slammed shut at once. Lucas froze. The air in the room thickened, pressing against his skin like something unseen had filled the space. Mark's lips moved again, but the words made no sense. The voice was slow, deliberate, layered with something that didn't belong in a human throat. Lucas backed away. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced himself to move. Mark didn't follow. He just stood there, watching. A sound came from behind. Footsteps. Lucas spun around. The hallway stretched in both directions, empty. The doors that had slammed shut now stood ajar. A shadow moved at the end of the hall. It slipped out of sight before Lucas could focus on it. A chill spread through his chest. He turned back to Mark, but the room was empty. A sharp knock echoed from downstairs. Lucas ran. His feet barely touched the steps as he descended. He saw Riley standing in the open doorway, eyes locked on something outside. Daniel was next to her, gripping her wrist. The mist had thickened. The trees beyond the clearing were almost invisible, their shapes swallowed in white. The knocking came again, louder this time, not from the front door, from the walls. Daniel pulled Riley back inside and slammed the door shut. Lucas grabbed his arm. Mark is gone. Daniel's face was pale, so are our bags. Lucas's stomach dropped. He looked past them. The living room was empty. No backpacks, no keys. Everything they had packed was gone. Riley whispered something under her breath. Lucas barely heard it. They don't want us to leave it with you. The knocking didn't stop. It grew faster, spreading across the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The entire cabin trembled with the force of it. Daniel cursed. He grabbed the fireplace poker and stepped toward the door. Lucas stopped him. That's not a person. Daniel hesitated. The knocking stopped. The silence stretched too long. Then something clicked. Not the front door, not the windows, the attic. Lucas looked up. The ceiling above them creaked. Dust drifted down. A slow, dragging sound moved across the beams. They weren't alone in the house. The attic hatch was slightly open. A sliver of darkness stretched across the ceiling. Dust floated down, twisting in the dim light. Lucas felt the weight of the silence pressing down. Riley stood frozen, her eyes locked on the opening. Daniel clenched the fireplace poker, his grip tight enough to turn his knuckles white. A slow, deliberate creak echoed from above. Something shifted. Daniel exhaled, barely a sound. We need to leave now, Lucas nodded. Riley hesitated but followed as they moved toward the door. Then a whisper drifted down from the attic, soft, almost familiar. Lucas. He stopped, his name drawn out, stretched thin. His breath caught in his throat. Daniel grabbed his arm. Don't listen. The whisper came again, closer. Lucas's legs felt heavy, his body unsteady. Something was behind him. Riley yanked the door open. Cold air rushed in. The mist outside had thickened, pressing against the cabin like a living thing. The trees barely visible, their shapes shifting in the dense white. They ran. The ground felt unstable beneath them, the dirt road stretching too far. Lucas glanced back once. The cabin loomed in the mist, dark, still. The attic hatch was fully open now. Something moved inside. He turned away. Daniel was ahead, his breath harsh in the silence. Riley kept close, her footsteps unsteady. Then she stopped. Lucas nearly collided into her. Daniel turned, his face twisted in confusion. Riley stood still, staring at something in the trees. Lucas followed her gaze. A figure stood between the trunks, barely visible through the fog, too tall, too thin. Its head tilted slowly. A voice, distant, stretched and wrong. Leave. Daniel grabbed Riley's wrist. She didn't move, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused. Lucas shook her. She blinked. We have to go. She nodded, her face pale. They ran again. The car should have been close. Lucas knew the distance. They had walked it before, but the road kept stretching. The trees never ended. The mist curled around their ankles, pulling at them. The whisper came again, not from behind, from the road ahead. Something was waiting for them. Lucas slowed. The road stretched endlessly, the trees pressing in. The mist coiled around them, shifting like something alive. His breath came in sharp gasps. Riley's hand was cold in his grip. Daniel kept glancing back. His face was tense, his jaw clenched. We should have reached the car by now. Lucas didn't answer. The whisper still lingered in his ears, soft, familiar, wrong. Riley stumbled. Lucas caught her before she hit the ground. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused. Daniel looked around. This isn't real. The words felt heavier than they should. The trees seemed closer, the road ahead darker, the mist thickened, swallowing the last bit of daylight. Then the footsteps started, not theirs, slow, measured, from all sides. Lucas turned, The figure was closer now, still too tall, still too thin. Its head tilted in an unnatural angle. Leave. The voice scratched at his mind, not loud, but everywhere. Daniel grabbed his wrist. Run. They didn't argue. The road blurred, the trees twisted, the mist pulled at them, slowing their steps. Riley gasped, her breath sharp. Lucas glanced back. The figure didn't move, but it was closer. Daniel cursed under his breath. The ground felt unsteady. The trees loomed impossibly high. Then the car was there, too sudden, too perfect. Riley hesitated. Lucas didn't. He yanked the door open and pushed her inside. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered. Lucas's heart pounded. The figure stood at the edge of the trees now, close enough to see its face. No, not a face. A mask of stretched skin. The engine roared to life. Daniel slammed the gas. The tires spun against the dirt before catching. The car lurched forward. The figure didn't move, but the trees did. Shifting, closing. The road twisted, stretching longer as they sped down it. Lucas clenched the seat. They weren't getting out. The road kept stretching. The trees blurred past, their shapes twisting unnaturally. The headlights barely cut through the thick mist. Daniel's hands were tight on the wheel. Riley pressed against the door, her breath shallow. Lucas kept looking back. The figure was gone, or it had never been there. The car jolted. The road was shifting beneath them, pulling them back. Daniel gritted his teeth, pushing the gas harder. Then the mist thinned. The trees broke apart. The road was normal again. The cabin was gone. No one spoke. The town lights flickered in the distance. They didn't stop driving. They never spoke of it again.